Hello, everyone. I'm George Roscoe.
And I'm Mark Schneider.
And we want to welcome you to today's episode 64 of Say What, where we talk about the threats to our children in the public school system, including the introduction of queer theory.
That's right, George. You know, June is, of course, Pride Month, where all LGBTQ plus ideology is being promoted and celebrated across the nation, including its schools, and including the destructive lie of queer theory, which, George, begs the question, what is queer theory? I know you've taken a hard look at this.
Yes, and parents, we apologize. This is going to be one of those very dry episodes, but we really need you to give us 20 minutes of your time here to really understand the academic stance of queer theory and how it's being taught in higher education, because what used to be just a critical social theory in colleges around the country has made its way into the public school system, into broader culture, and we don't hear people talk about this much, so we're going to try to introduce it, give it some justice with, by really addressing its core claims. But at the same time, like I said, it is dry, and please listen to it. And here's why: because next week's episode, we're actually going to get into the examples of how this is being taught, or where it's being taught, or the curriculums out there, and how it's made its way into public schools all across the country.
So I expect that this is derived from higher academia and has filtered its way down into the K through 12 public education system. But George, what is it? What is queer theory? How do you define it?
All right. So let me just kind of frame the conversation here, so that way as parents listen to us, they won't get kind of lost. But ultimately, there's three things that I want us to really understand about queer theory. Number one, there's this idea of normal, or because, academics try to create new words, normativity. Mm-hmm. So you're going to hear the word normativity a lot. And that's just because they want to remove any sense of an idea of deviance or taboo. These people they want to remove those concepts.
There is nothing that's taboo.
But what's interesting, and I'm going to repeat myself over and over in these kind of illogical checkmates, it's taboo to have a taboo.
Yes, of course.
So parents, you're going to catch on to this, because I'm going to be repeating myself on these illogical checkmates. Number two, identity. So queer theory not only deals with normalcy or normativity, but it also deals with identity, and it has its own doctrines, right? So the only constant is change. So the queer identity is a fluid identity. So that's number two. And number three, there are many other things, but I just chose these as kind of my top three things to understand queer theory, is power. So if normal or normativity or normalcy is not there, it needs to always change. If identity is always fluid, because it cannot be normal, and so change is the only constant. Under power, queer theory tells us that, we have a problem by, society historically has always created binaries, and binaries regress into hierarchy. Therefore, it's oppressive. Therefore, you have to change it. That cannot be the normal.
There's always an oppressive component to just about everything that POK covers in this lexicon, starting with sex and gender theory, critical race theory, even social and emotional learning. They all view the world through this filter of victimhood, which pits one group against another group. And, it's just interesting. So queer theory is part and parcel of that same concept.
It definitely is. And so the last thing under power here is a kind of a sub-doctrine of it, is that because binary creates hierarchy, therefore creating oppression, you have to liberate people.
Of course.
And that liberation aspect, basically they call out for a, compulsory activism. You have to become an activist to free people of this power struggle.
What if I don't want to be liberated from my worldview? What happens to me?
Then you are what they would probably call, heteronormative, and that's evil. You got to understand that you are just a social construct, so you need to change your identity and just be fluid. So again, there are a lot of illogical falsities in all of this. A real quick history lesson. Where did this kind of come about? So the three most influential early queer theorists are Judith Butler, Gail Rubin, and Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick. And really the term queer theory dates back to 1990 when an Italian feminist and film theorist, Teresa Dell'Artis, coined the term for a conference in the special issue of a feminist journal on its themes. But really they all of these major queer theorists have really started and based their work on a French postmodernist named Michael, I hope I pronounce his name right, Foucault.
Yeah.
So you don't
That's
pronounce
Michel
T's.
Foucault.
Okay. And so the history, he wrote this book called The History of Sexuality back in 1980.
Yeah.
And so kind of the queer theorist simmered on his works for well over a decade, and then in the 90s they came out with their theory. So I'm going to try to quickly here define queer theory. And a lot of what I use here has come out of the University of Massachusetts, which Massachusetts is very, very liberal. And then also from James Lindsay, who many of you guys, we've introduced you to him before. He's not a Christian. He's an atheist agnostic, but has done a lot of research on this topic, and especially just into the critical social theories. So queer theory critically examines the way power works to institutionalize and legitimate certain forms and expressions of sexuality and gender while stigmatizing others. So queer theory emerged out of the LGBT movement, but here's one huge distinction. Whereas LGBT studies seek to analyze LGBT people as stable identities, this is where queer theory takes it to like this, crazy extreme. Queer theory actually challenges stable identities and say they're problematic. You cannot have any rigid identity categories.
So being lesbian, gay, somewhere in the binary spectrum, or transgender is considered by queer theory to be a stable identity?
Correct.
Wow.
Yes. So
say what?
So this is really crazy, and so this is actually what many people are probably going to have a hard time as they go in and study queer theory. Is then they have to ask, well, how in the world then are queer theorists part of the LGBT movement?
Yeah.
And what I've come to realize is there's subcultures here in this movement. We've always been maybe conditioned to think that the LGBT movement is monolithic. But it is not. It is actually very splintered, and we haven't understood it well enough to know how to attack its weak spots and splinter them, so that way they kind of dissolve this false unity that they have. So maybe this is an idea that POK can work on. But, queer theory is often considered the deconstruction of LGBT studies.
Amazing.
This is crazy. I mean, this is from the University of Massachusetts, coming straight out of their Queer Theory 101 course. I downloaded their syllabus. It was actually a 10-page syllabi. It was really well detailed and put together by this professor. And so some of this stuff is coming straight out of there.
George, before you get too far into this, is this a course of instruction at universities now?
Yes.
Queer theory?
Oh, yes.
Is this something you can major in some universities?
I think it's part of their gender studies major.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and I
It's probably not just at private schools also.
No, I
so
did
our tax dollars are going to pay for this kind of
This is in public schools.
Yeah.
In public schools, let's just say for now, in the universities, public universities. So queer theory follows and expands on feminist theory, And then there is also a huge key relationship between queer theory and other social theories, because all of these theories critique power, privilege, and normativity. And so one of the very interesting things is that queer theory is somehow related to like critical race theory, transgender studies, feminist theory, disability studies. But queer theory is opposed to a lot of the ways that those theories actually, what they actually believe in. And we'll talk a little bit about how it differentiates itself from critical race theory, because queer theorists do not agree with how critical race theorists posit their stances. So then what is the natural conclusion of queer theory? Well, there is basically a perpetual, never-ending war against normalcy. And this is where it becomes problematic, because by seeking to have a ground on which to, evangelize and proselytize their views, they constantly undercut their own ground.
Yeah.
Because that's what you have to do.
Because it's normal to be abnormal. So it becomes a vicious, illogical cycle.
Correct.
Whatever you take on as your latest theory that you're propounding itself becomes normalized after a time.
Correct.
Which goes against your very identity if you're into queer theory.
Yeah. So then the question becomes, why do they think that way? And what I've understood from their writings is they think that way because they believe that our sex, our gender, our sexuality is a social construct, and it comes. So, for example, me at my age right now, over my life experience, I've constructed my own identity in terms of sexuality and gender. And 30 years from now, I've accumulated more knowledge. I've come into contact with more ideas. So I should have continued. I'm using this word loosely, evolving. But what they mean is I should have deconstructed my old, whatever I am now, and 30 years from now, I should really have a new gender identity and sexuality identity, because we're constantly learning. So that's why for them, this state of normalcy is almost warranted, because we're never going to be the same people. We're always evolving in our understanding.
So what do the queer theorists have to say to people that claim that they were born into the wrong gender and they need to transition?
The queer theorists would have to say that that is a false premise.
So they would urge people not to transition or to remain fluid in their identity?
See, what they would say is that the premise that you mentioned, born in the wrong body,
yes,
that's wrong. Your desire to transition, that's honorable.
Interesting. Nonsensical, but interesting.
Correct. So then let's talk a little bit about how queer theory and identity really work hand in hand. So one theoretical strategy relies on an insistence on the social construction of gender and sexuality. So theories of social construction claim that human identities are not inherent or essential, but rather emerge out of social relationships and discourse. So Butler, in her work in 1990, she understands gender as produced through repetitive practices of personal and social practices. So in other words, one's gender does not exist a priori discourse, but instead is constructed by characteristics and experiences. So really at the base of social constructionist theories is this assumption that since identities are constructed, they can always be deconstructed or constructed otherwise.
So where is the component of reality to this? Why should we pay any attention to this at all? It sounds to me like it's just utterly subjective. It's your lived experience, whatever you're feeling at the time you're feeling it determines your identity, but don't get too far into it because it could change over time with new lived experiences.
Correct. So to me, what I understand from these queer theorists is they are actually the true postmodernists. Postmodernism has always struggled for a root in society in a very major way because of its agnosticism, because of you feel what you feel. It's really the ultimate never-ending, there are 7 billion truths out there, one for every person, right? So queer theorists actually adopt postmodernism to its infinite end. And so, there is going to be a never-ending, not necessarily search for truth, but never-ending quantities or variations of truth.
So, George, how much influence has this had in, I guess, in identity circles, that people that study this? Is this a big campaign on college campuses? I mean, are lots of students taking these courses, and how? Maybe this is something we're going to talk about in the next in our next version. But is this something that has taken root in the K through 12 public school system?
Yes and yes. In the universities, what I've seen is that this has become very popularized in the 90s. And then in the public schools, I have found very, very clear evidence from the early 2000s that this is already being thrown out there. So one final thing, Mark, on this queer theory and identity is I want to point out the distinction of queer theorists versus critical race theorists. Because under queer theory, the very essence of gender fluidity, is gender fluidity is the only identity you can have. You can't have an L, a G, a B, a T, a whatever else, a two-spirit. The only true identity is fluidity.
Yeah.
Now, how do you transfer that same principle from queer theory to critical race theory when critical race theorists say there is no thing as transracial? You can't be race fluid, right? That's very interesting. And that's where you see this unholy marriage between queer theorists and critical race theorists. And they really don't talk about that, with each other.
How can they? Because there's cognitive dissonance there.
There is, but still somehow they've learned to work together on this LGBT front.
Yeah.
So masterfully and powerfully. And I think we need to exploit some of these differences to get them to start infighting and splintering.
So all the labels that we currently have, LGBT, even two-spirit, I can't even remember all of them. There are so many of them. The queer theorists are saying none of these labels really apply.
They don't apply because they are stable, and number two, they become normal, and nothing can become normal.
Okay. So you're constantly in the state of fluidity, where the definitions in your self-identity are always changing.
Correct.
Okay.
So this is where it becomes really crazy, because I remember, Mark, 4 years ago when I first read my parent handbook from our school district.
Yeah.
I had never read it until then. And I was reading the bathroom policy. And here in California, I think it was in 2013, when the bathroom bill got passed by Governor Jerry Brown. And basically, the policy is written in such a way that any boy or girl can go into any restroom of their choice on any given day. They do not have to have certainty in their identity to say, okay, well, now I'm a girl, so for this school year, I'm going to go into the girls' restroom.
Right.
The policy was written in such a way where it actually believes in queer theory. It allows for this infinite gender fluidity and change, and therefore an administrator or a teacher cannot question a child going back and forth, back and forth.
So, George, my question is, in the queer theorist lexicon, does the term gender even really apply anymore? Because gender, when you think about it, it's the expression of how you feel your sex is, however you apply your sexual orientation and how others perceive you and how you want to be perceived. it sounds to me like you're saying none of those current labels apply. So, and if that's the case, does the term gender itself, is it meaningful?
So what I would say is that gender applies, it still does. However, because gender is constantly fluid, all that they are against is anything stable. So, for example, you could call yourself today a gay person, but if you're going to, debate with a queer theorist that you've been gay all of your life, you were born this way, they would debate that with you.
Yeah.
So a queer theorist would expect that, 3 years from now when they meet you, you're no longer gay, but you might be bisexual this time.
So I guess if you're having a dialogue with another queer theorist, you might say something like, well, today I feel like I'm leaning male.
Bingo.
But tomorrow, that may change.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't put any teeth in your self-identity, knowing that you're expected to change over time.
And I guess the last thing I'll say, Mark, is because queer theory is so stupid, so out there, so crazy, so loony, it's sometimes hard for us to be able to know how to, debate with them, how to, create counter arguments. But, at its core, I'm just hoping right now as we get to the end that parents understand queer theory brings along this idea of normativity, normalcy, and that's not good. Deviances and taboos do not exist. So it's just creating a new normal where the new normal is a constant change. Identity, it must be fluid. And power, it must be dealt with because binaries create hierarchies, which in turn create oppression, which then calls for liberation. And therefore, a queer theorist is in a constant state of activism in order to liberate people from what they're being oppressed. And what they are being oppressed is by their normalcy.
Well, George, thank you for looking into this. This is really valuable material. I know we're going to be talking about this more next week, or we're going to actually start to apply queer theory in the public realm and see how it's affecting society. But in the meantime, we encourage you to go to our website, protectourkidsnow.org, and take a look at all the resources there. One of the things that you will find are some of our newest videos. In fact, we just published our newest video, What is the Triple Threat? And we've done so in several different languages. Currently, we have it in Korean, and we also have it in Spanish as well as English. And the other video that we've recently released is one that George Roska has done, and that is What is Social and Emotional Learning? So these are each anywhere from 8 to 10 minutes long. I think it's really valuable information. So please make sure you look at that information, share it with other people that you know, your friends and neighbors, and get the word out about what's happening to our kids in the public school system. And we will see you next week on Say What.